The only sounds in the house were the gentle hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the old wooden floorboards settling. My husband, Robert, had retreated upstairs hours ago, a familiar routine these days. He'd lose himself in his books or escape into his world through headphones. Our love, once vibrant and full of life, had dwindled into a faint echo, a faded photograph tucked away in the album of our past. But tonight, my thoughts weren't focused on him. They were downstairs, centered on the young man sprawled on the couch, his long legs stretched out and a book resting on his lap. It was Daniel, my stepson, Robert's son from his first marriage. He was home from college for the weekend, claiming he needed a break from dorm life. His words were simple enough, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to his visit than he was letting on. There was a certain way his gaze lingered on mine when he spoke, a softness in his voice when he said, "It's good to see you again, Mom." Something unspoken hung between us, a feeling I hadn't dared to fully acknowledge. As the evening wore on, I busied myself in the kitchen, pretending to clean. My hands moved restlessly, shifting dishes from one side of the sink to the other while my mind wandered. The sound of Daniel's laughter drifted in from the living room, soft and melodic. He hadn't laughed like that in a long time, not since Robert and I had grown apart, and certainly not since the last tense family dinner we all tried to pretend hadn't happened. I dried my hands on a dish towel and paused at the threshold of the living room. He looked up as I entered, his face illuminated by the soft glow of the lamp. "You're still up," he said, a hint of surprise in his voice. "So are you," I replied, settling into the armchair across from him. "What are you reading?" I asked. He held up the cover of a well-worn novel, one we had read together when he was younger, back when our nights were filled with laughter and bedtime stories. A wistful smile touched my lips. "You kept that?" I asked. "Of course," he replied. "You always said this one was special." The air between us grew heavy, and for a moment neither of us spoke. He leaned forward, closing the book and resting his elbows on his knees, his gaze fixed on me. I felt the weight of it, as though he was searching for something, understanding perhaps, or simply a connection. "You seem different," he said softly. I laughed, but it sounded hollow even to my own ears. "Different how?" I asked. He shrugged but didn't look away. "I don't know. Like you're holding something back." His words struck a deep chord within me. Daniel had always been perceptive, even as a child. It was something I both loved and feared about him, the way he could see right through me. "I guess I've just been tired lately," I said, trying to brush off the conversation, but the truth clung to me like a shadow. I was tired of a loveless marriage, of the silence where there had once been passion, of feeling like a ghost in my own home. Daniel's expression softened. "You deserve more than that, Mom." His words, so simple, caught me off guard, and for a moment I forgot how to breathe. He leaned back against the couch, his eyes never leaving mine, and I felt a strange mixture of comfort and vulnerability. It wasn't just what he said. It was how he said it, as though he truly believed it, as though he had been waiting for me to believe it too. I stood up abruptly, the moment too raw, too close. "I should head to bed," I said. He stood as well, stepping toward me. "Mom." I froze as his hand brushed mine. The touch was brief, fleeting, but it sent a shiver through me. I couldn't bring myself to move, to look at him, to acknowledge the storm brewing between us. "You don't have to do this alone," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Something inside me broke then, some fragile dam that had been holding back years of loneliness and longing. I stepped back, my heart pounding so loudly that I was sure he could hear it. "Daniel, My words faltered as I saw the look in his eyes. It wasn't pity, it wasn't judgment. It was understanding, pure and unfiltered, and it left me feeling both exposed and comforted all at once. I turned and fled to the sanctuary of my bedroom, closing the door behind me as though it could shut out the truth. My heart raced as I pressed my back against the cool wood, tears pricking at the corners of my eyes. What was happening to us? To me? The next morning, sunlight streamed through the curtains, warm and relentless, filling the room with light. But it couldn't dispel the shadows of the night before. I had barely slept, tossing and turning with thoughts I wasn't ready to face. The house was still quiet when I made my way downstairs. Daniel sat at the kitchen table, a steaming mug of coffee in his hands. He glanced up when I entered, his eyes meeting mine for a brief moment. Neither of us said anything. It wasn't awkward, not exactly, but there was a weight to the silence, as though the air around us had shifted and we were standing on unfamiliar ground. "Morning," he said, his voice calm and steady, almost too normal, as if nothing had happened. "Morning," I replied, moving to the counter to pour myself a cup of coffee. The routine felt grounding, a lifeline amid the storm of emotions inside me. I kept my back to him longer than necessary, willing myself to regain control. "You okay?" he asked after a moment. I turned to face him, the question hanging between us like a challenge. "Why wouldn't I be?" I replied. He smiled faintly, knowingly. "You seemed upset last night," he said, the understatement of the year. I sipped my coffee to buy time, the bitter taste a harsh contrast to the sweetness of his concern. "I was just tired, Daniel, that's all," I said. He nodded, but his expression told me he didn't believe a word I said. He was giving me space, I realized. Space to pretend, to bury what neither of us was ready to acknowledge. The day passed in fragments. Robert, as usual on a Saturday, was lost in his own world, tinkering with something in the garage, completely unaware of the subtle currents swirling through the house. Daniel and I danced around each other like cautious strangers sharing the same space. We were satellites orbiting a shared point, drawn together by an invisible force, yet never quite colliding. Every casual interaction felt loaded, every shared glance held an unspoken weight, a silent acknowledgement of the boundary we had almost crossed. We didn't address it, didn't dare to. By the time the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, the silence between us had grown louder than any words we could have spoken. I found myself curled up on the couch, a soft blanket draped over my legs, trying to lose myself in a magazine, but the words blurred before my eyes. Soon after, Daniel joined me in the living room. He settled down at the opposite end of the couch, maintaining a distance that felt anything but safe. The glow of the television flickered across his face, highlighting the quiet intensity in his gaze whenever I chanced to look his way. "You used to love this movie," he said softly, nodding toward the screen. It was an old classic we had watched countless times as a family. "I still do," I replied, my voice barely a whisper, though my mind wasn't on the plot. My attention was completely drawn to him, to the way his presence filled the room, a silent, magnetic pull. We sat like that for a while, the silence both comfortable and charged. My heart would flutter every time he shifted slightly closer, as though the invisible space between us was slowly, almost imperceptibly, being erased. Then, out of nowhere, he spoke, his voice low and thoughtful. "Do you ever think about how things could have been different?" I turned to him, startled by the question. "What do you mean?" I asked, my heart skipping a beat. He shrugged, his eyes fixed on the screen, though I knew he wasn't really seeing it. "With Dad, with us, if things hadn't changed." I knew exactly what he meant. He wasn't just talking about the increasing arguments. or the growing emotional chasm between Robert and me. He was talking about the life we had all lost somewhere along the way. The laughter, the easy connection, the feeling of being a whole happy family. All the time, I admitted, the words slipping out before I could stop them, dangerous admissions of something far deeper than I had intended. But we can't change the past, I added, trying to steer the conversation back to safer territory. No, he said softly, turning his head to look at me, his gaze intense. But we can change the present. My breath caught in my throat. His words hung between us, heavy and full of unspoken meaning. I turned to him fully, searching his face for something, reassurance, clarity, anything to anchor me in the storm of emotions threatening to pull me under. Daniel, I whispered his name, fragile on my lips, a warning and a plea all at once. He leaned forward, closing the distance between us. His hand reached out, brushing lightly against mine. It was a small gesture, barely a touch, but it sent a spark through me, igniting something I had tried so hard to bury. We can't, I whispered, shaking my head slightly, even though I didn't pull my hand away. It's not right, he asked, his voice barely audible, his eyes locked on mine. Why not? It's just us, Daniel. Mom, no one else. No one would understand. But that doesn't mean it's wrong, he countered, his thumb gently stroking the back of my hand. I finally pulled my hand away, the weight of his words crashing down on me. Daniel, stop. But he didn't stop. He moved closer, his eyes locked on mine with an intensity that made my heart race. I see you, he said, his voice firm but gentle. Not as the woman you think you have to be, not as Dad's wife, just you. Tears stung my eyes. You don't know what you're saying. Yes, I do, he said, reaching for my hand again. This time, I didn't pull away immediately. His touch was warm, grounding, yet it felt like I was stepping into a fire. You deserve to be happy. The words cut through me, sharp and undeniable. I wanted to believe him, to let myself feel the weight of his conviction, but the fear, the guilt, the shame, they were insurmountable. I stood up quickly, wrapping the blanket around me like a shield. This has to stop, Daniel. We can't. I can't. He didn't try to stop me as I walked away, my heart racing in my chest, but his words stayed with me, echoing in my mind long after I had locked myself in my room. You deserve to be happy. Those words lingered, haunting me throughout the night. Sleep came in fractured intervals, my mind replaying Daniel's face, the sincerity in his voice, the way he had looked at me when he said those words. It wasn't just the words themselves, it was the way they made me feel, like I had been seen, truly seen, for the first time in years. The next morning was heavy with unspoken tension. Robert had left early for work, as he usually did on Sundays. Once the door closed behind him, the house fell into a deep silence, a silence that felt different from the usual emptiness. Daniel was in the kitchen, pouring himself a cup of coffee. He looked up as I entered, his expression unreadable. "Morning," he said. "Morning," I replied, my voice sounding strained even to my own ears. I moved to the counter, grabbed a mug, and poured myself some coffee. The mundane act should have helped ground me, but it didn't. The air felt thick, as if the house itself was holding its breath. "About last night," he started, his voice hesitant, but I raised a hand to stop him. "Please, Daniel, we don't need to talk about it." "Yes, we do." He set his cup down and turned to face me completely. "You're acting like it didn't happen, but it did, and I'm not going to pretend it didn't." I looked at him, my heart pounding in my chest. "Daniel, we can't. Whatever this is, it's not right." "Why?" he asked, his voice rising slightly. Because someone else decided it wasn't? Because society says it's wrong? That doesn't make it any less real. His words hit me like a wave, leaving me breathless. I wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong, but the truth lodged itself in my throat. He wasn't wrong, not entirely, but that didn't make it okay. I turned away, gripping the edge of the counter as if it could keep me grounded. "It doesn't matter if it's real," I said finally, my voice trembling slightly. "It can't happen. You're my stepson." "I'm an adult," he countered, taking a step closer. "I'm not a kid anymore. You know that." I closed my eyes, willing myself to stay calm. "Then please, don't make this harder than it already is." For a moment there was only silence, the sound of my own ragged breathing filling the quiet kitchen. Then I felt him step even closer, his presence warm and overwhelming just behind me. "I'm not trying to make it harder," he said softly, his voice right next to my ear. "I just want you to be honest with yourself, with me." I opened my eyes and slowly turned to face him, my resolve wavering under the intensity of his gaze. "Honesty doesn't change the fact, Daniel." He searched my face, his expression raw and vulnerable. "Maybe not, but it changes how we move forward." The weight of his words settled over me, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. He was right. This wasn't something we could ignore or pretend away. It was there, hanging between us, whether we wanted it to be or not. But acknowledging it felt like stepping onto a path I wasn't ready to walk. I took a step back, creating a small but significant distance between us. "I can't do this," I said, my voice trembling. "Please, Daniel, just give me time." He didn't argue. He simply nodded, his expression resigned but understanding. "Okay," he said quietly. "I'll give you time, but I won't pretend this isn't real." I nodded, my throat too tight to respond. I turned and left the kitchen, retreating once again to the safety of my room, but even there, I couldn't escape the storm raging inside me. His words echoed relentlessly in my mind, undeniable. The rest of the day passed in a hazy blur. I avoided Daniel as much as possible, throwing myself into a flurry of chores and errands that didn't actually need doing. I scrubbed countertops until they gleamed, reorganized the pantry for the third time that week, anything to keep my hands and mind occupied, anything to avoid the quiet intensity that emanated from him whenever we were in the same room. By evening, I was physically and emotionally exhausted, but the underlying tension in the house hadn't lessened in the slightest. It felt like a coiled spring, ready to snap at any moment. That night, as I sat in the living room with a book I couldn't focus on, Daniel appeared in the doorway. He hesitated for a long moment, his silhouette framed by the soft light from the hallway, before stepping inside. His movements were cautious, almost hesitant. "Can I sit?" he asked, his voice low. I nodded, my heart doing a nervous little flutter as he settled into the armchair across from me, the same chair I had occupied the night he arrived. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The silence was heavy, thick with unspoken feelings, but it wasn't entirely uncomfortable, not anymore. There was a strange sort of understanding that had begun to bloom in the quiet spaces between us. "I don't want to fight," he said finally, his gaze meeting mine across the room. I want to understand." I set the book down on the coffee table, folding my hands in my lap to keep them from trembling. "Understand what?" "Why you're so afraid," he said, his voice gentle but direct. "What are you really scared of, Mom?" His question cut deeper than I wanted to admit. I looked at him, really looked at him, at the earnestness in his eyes, the vulnerability that mirrored my own. "I'm scared of losing you," I said honestly, the words barely a whisper, "of ruining everything." "You won't lose me," he said firmly, his gaze unwavering. "You couldn't, even if you tried." His words were a comfort, a small balm to my wounded soul, but they didn't erase the gnawing fear that still held me captive. "Daniel, this isn't just about us. There's your father, our family, the way the world would see this." He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his gaze intense. "The world doesn't have to know. This is about us, Mom. No one else." I shook my head, tears stinging my eyes. "It's not that simple." "Maybe it is," he said softly, his voice laced with a hopeful yearning. "Maybe we're just making it harder than it has to be." His words hung in the air between us, and for a fleeting moment I allowed myself to imagine a world where he was right, a world where we could follow the strange, undeniable pull that had developed between us without consequence. But reality was never that kind. I stood up abruptly, my hands trembling. "I need some air," I said, grabbing my coat from the coat rack by the door and heading outside. The cool night air hit me like a shock, but it did little to quiet the storm raging inside me. I walked aimlessly down the quiet street, the sound of my footsteps on the pavement a grounding rhythm in the chaos of my thoughts. I didn't know where I was going or what I was searching for, only that I needed to keep moving to escape the suffocating weight of the emotions swirling within me. When I finally returned, the house was dark, except for a single lamp burning in the living room. Daniel was waiting for me, sitting on the porch swing, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice filled with a quiet concern. "No," I admitted, sinking down onto the swing beside him, the wood creaking softly under our weight. "But I will be." He nodded, his eyes filled with an emotion I couldn't quite name, a mixture of hope and a deep, unwavering understanding. "I meant what I said, Mom. We'll wait, for as long as it takes." I didn't respond, couldn't find the words. Instead, I simply nodded, the cool night air stinging my cheeks. I stood up and turned towards the house, the weight of his words following me like a shadow as I climbed the stairs to my room. The change in our dynamic was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, creeping into the spaces between us like a tide lapping at the shore. I couldn't pinpoint the exact moment it began, but somewhere in the days that followed Daniel's visit, the sharp tension that had hung over us softened into something else, something quieter, something intimate. It started with the little things. His hand brushing against mine when we passed in the kitchen, a touch that lingered just a fraction of a second longer than necessary. The way he would linger in the living room after Robert had gone upstairs, even after the television had been turned off, the silence stretching into the late hours of the night, filled with hushed conversations about everything and nothing. One evening, a few weeks after his visit, I found myself sitting beside him on the couch again. The soft glow of the lamp cast a golden hue over the room, a warm and comforting light that felt like a fragile shield against the outside world. Robert had retreated upstairs as usual, leaving us alone in the comfortable silence that had somehow become our sanctuary. Daniel was scrolling through his phone, his focus seemingly elsewhere, but I could feel the familiar awareness between us, a subtle energy that hummed beneath the surface of our casual proximity. "Do you remember that summer we spent at the lake house?" he asked suddenly, his voice cutting through the quiet like a warm knife through butter. I glanced at him, startled by the unexpected question. "Of course. You were, 10? 11? He corrected me with a small, nostalgic smile. 11. You taught me how to swim that summer. I was terrified of the water, but you didn't give up on me. I laughed softly, the memory tugging at my heart. You were so determined. I remember how proud you were when you finally floated without holding on to me. He turned to me then, his gaze steady and direct, all traces of amusement gone. I wasn't just proud of myself, Mom. I was proud because I didn't let you down. The words caught me off guard, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. There was something in the way he looked at me, something raw and unspoken, a deep well of emotion that made my chest ache. You've never let me down, Daniel, I said quietly, the weight of the moment pressing against my ribs. He didn't respond right away. Instead, he reached out, his hand brushing against mine, a mirror of that fleeting touch from weeks ago. Yet this time it felt different, more deliberate. The touch was tentative, almost hesitant, but it lingered, a silent question hanging in the air between us. I didn't pull away, couldn't. Mom, he began, his voice low and filled with a vulnerability that made my heart race. His thumb gently traced the back of my hand. I can't stop thinking about you. I closed my eyes, the words sinking into me like stones in a still pond, creating ripples of complicated emotions. Daniel, this is... please, I whispered, my voice thick with unshed tears. He interrupted me, his tone gentle but firm. Just listen. I opened my eyes to find him watching me, his expression open and unguarded. I know this isn't easy. I know it's complicated and messy and so many other things I can't even put into words, but I can't pretend anymore. I can't keep pushing this feeling down. His confession hung in the air, heavy and charged, leaving me breathless. The weight of his emotions mirrored the turmoil in my own heart. Daniel, you don't understand what you're asking. Yes, I do, he said, his voice steady, his gaze never leaving mine. I'm not asking for anything you don't want to give. I just want you to be honest with yourself, with me. I looked away, the intensity of his gaze too much to bear. It's not that simple. Maybe it is, he said softly, his hand tightening around mine, his touch sending a shiver down my spine. Maybe we've just been telling ourselves it isn't because we're scared. I didn't know how to respond to that. The truth was he wasn't wrong. But that didn't make it any easier to face the strange, forbidden connection that had grown between us. The space between us seemed to shrink, and for a fleeting moment I wondered if I was just as trapped as he was, bound by something neither of us could fully control. But before I could say anything, before I could even fully process the whirlwind of emotions swirling inside me, the door at the top of the stairs creaked open, and Robert's voice, laced with a hint of sleepiness, called down, "Hey, you two! What's going on down there?" The unexpected interruption shattered the fragile intimacy of the moment, leaving the heavy, unspoken words hanging in the air, unresolved and suddenly exposed. Robert's voice, though casual, acted like a bucket of cold water thrown over a simmering fire. The charged atmosphere in the living room instantly dissipated, replaced by a familiar, strained normalcy. Daniel and I sprang apart as if burned, the lingering touch of our hands now feeling like a forbidden memory. The unspoken words hung heavy in the air, no longer a secret shared between two souls, but a fragile thing exposed to the possibility of discovery. The rest of Daniel's weekend visit passed with a renewed sense of awkwardness. We were careful in our interactions, polite and considerate, but the easy camaraderie and the intense intimacy of the previous night were gone, replaced by a deliberate distance. I found myself constantly on edge, acutely aware of Robert's oblivious presence and the weight of the unspoken feelings that now lay between Daniel and me. On Sunday evening, it was time for Daniel to return to his own life. The goodbye at the door was brief and seemingly casual, a quick hug and a few polite words. But as he turned to leave, I caught a lingering look in his eyes, a silent promise or perhaps a question left unanswered. I wondered what he was thinking, what he expected after the raw honesty of his confession. After Daniel drove away, the house felt even quieter than before. The silence no longer a comfortable shared space, but an echoing void filled with my own turbulent thoughts. I replayed the events of the weekend in my mind. Daniel's unexpected declaration, and the confusing tangle of emotions it had stirred within me. I couldn't deny the truth anymore. The distance that had grown between Robert and me had created a profound loneliness, a void in my life. And Daniel's attention, though undeniably complicated and potentially wrong, had filled that void in a way I hadn't anticipated. I grappled with a storm of conflicting emotions, guilt, confusion, a surprising sense of longing, and a flicker of something that felt dangerously like hope. Days turned into weeks. Daniel and I exchanged sporadic text messages, brief and innocuous, checking in on each other with the casualness of family. But beneath the surface of those short messages, I sensed the lingering echo of our shared moments, a silent acknowledgement of the unspoken feelings that still connected us. I began to observe my relationship with Robert with a newfound clarity. The comfortable routine we had built over the years now felt like a cage. I saw the lack of true intimacy, the absence of genuine connection, and the deep-seated unhappiness that I had been ignoring, or perhaps simply accepting, for far too long. Our lives had become parallel lines, never intersecting, never truly touching. One evening, I found myself alone in the living room, sitting on the same couch where Daniel and I had shared those intense, vulnerable moments. I picked up the worn novel we used to read together, the familiar weight of it in my hands, bringing a rush of nostalgia. I remembered Daniel's words echoing in my mind, "You deserve to be happy." The simplicity of that statement, coupled with the raw emotion in his voice, resonated with me in a way nothing had in years. It was a seed planted in fertile ground, slowly beginning to take root. I closed the book, a sense of resolve hardening within me. I could no longer ignore the quiet desperation that had become a constant companion. I had spent so many years focusing on Robert, on the family, on maintaining a semblance of normalcy, that I had forgotten to consider my own needs, my own desires. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the quiet suburban street, bathed in the soft glow of the streetlights. A sense of uncertainty washed over me, the path ahead shrouded in mist. But beneath the uncertainty, a new feeling began to stir, a fragile spark of hope. Daniel's unexpected visit, his bold confession, had been a catalyst, forcing me to confront the reality of my own unhappiness. The future was unclear, the choices daunting, but for the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to consider the possibility of a different life, a life where I might actually find the happiness I deserved. The weight of the past still lingered, but a new, hesitant sense of possibility had begun to dawn.